The explosions had already happened. Tirpitz was still afloat in the cold water of Kaa Fjord. Her flag still flew. Her armoured side still rose above the Norwegian anchorage, massive and apparently unbroken. But deep inside the ship, the truth was moving through twisted steel. Power stations had failed. Machinery had been torn from its mountings. Water had entered the double bottom. Rangefinders and control systems were damaged. The battleship had survived. Yet survival was not the same as readiness. Germany could endure the physical damage. Admitting how that damage had been inflicted was another matter. Because one of the most heavily protected warships in Euro had not been wounded by another battleship. She had not been caught in an open sea duel. She had been reached beneath the fjord by British craft so small that 4 men could barely live inside them. How could a naval command explain that? How could it admit that the giant had been touched by an enemy almost invisible beneath the water?
Before the full damage report is opened, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Stories such as this survive because people still choose to remember the men who entered machines that offered almost no comfort, little protection, and no promise of return. Tirpitz mattered long before the first charge exploded beneath her hull. She was the sister ship of Bismarck and one of the largest battleships ever built by Germany. Her heavy guns, armour, speed, and mere presence made her a strategic threat. Britain did not need Tirpitz to sink an Arctic convoy before taking her seriously. The possibility that she might sail was enough. The Arctic convoys carried weapons, vehicles, fuel, and other supplies to the Soviet Union. Their route passed through waters where storms, ice, darkness, German aircraft, submarines, and surface ships could all become killers. A sortie by Tirpitz could force merchant ships to scatter or compel the Royal Navy to commit powerful escorts that were urgently needed elsewhere. That was the strange power of the battleship in Norway. Even while anchored, she consumed British attention. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, aircraft, intelligence officers, and planners had to account for her. Tirpitz did not need to fire to shape operations. Her threat travelled farther than her shells. Germany understood this. That is why the ship was protected not merely as a weapon, but as a strategic symbol. Kaa Fjord lay within the wider Fjord system in northern Norway, surrounded by steep ground and difficult approaches. German precautions included hydrophones at the entrances, submarine chasers on patrol, guarded net barrages, and a separate net enclosure around the ships themselves. Anti-aircraft guns, smoke protection, patrol craft, and the geography of the fjords added further layers. Tirpitz was not hiding behind one defense. She sat inside a system designed to make approach, identification, attack, and escape almost impossible. German records themselves later listed hydrophones, patrols, guarded gaps, and net enclosures when examining how the British had entered. The British had guarded against the surface strength of Tirpitz with heavy ships. To strike her at anchor, something different was needed. The answer was the X-craft. They were called midget submarines, but the word can sound almost charming. There was nothing charming about serving in one. An X-craft was roughly 50 feet long and built for a crew of 4. Inside were batteries, machinery, controls, diving equipment, pipes, condensation, oil, stale air, and men forced to work within inches of one another. There was no room for the graceful routines associated with a large submarine. Every movement mattered. Every mechanical fault became personal. The craft carried explosive side charges rather than conventional torpedoes. The plan was to penetrate the defended anchorage, reach the target, release the charges beneath or beside the battleship, set time fuses, and withdraw before detonation. On paper, it was a weapon. Inside, it was a pressure tube filled with exhaustion. The Royal Navy had created the X-craft specifically because enemy capital ships were protected inside anchorages that ordinary forces could not easily reach. The official Admiralty account later described volunteers being called for special and hazardous service, while training continued through mechanical troubles and the difficult problem of towing the small craft within striking distance. 6 operational X-craft were eventually prepared for Operation Source. They could not cross the entire distance to Norway efficiently under their own power. Larger submarines therefore towed them across the North Sea. Passage crews endured the tow, then handed over to the operational crews near the target area. Even before the attack, the operation began taking men and machines. X9 was lost after her tow parted, taking her passage crew with her. X8 developed trouble with her explosive charges and had to be abandoned. X10, assigned against Scharnhorst, later found that mechanical and navigational difficulties made attack impossible. X5, X6 and X7 continued towards Tirpitz. This was not a neat procession towards glory. It was an operation already breaking apart. The surviving crews entered the fjord system, knowing that the return route might be as dangerous as the approach. They navigated through cold darkness, relying on instruments, brief observations through a periscope, memory, calculation, and nerve. The Germans had guarded the surface. The British chose the darkness below it. Inside X6, Lieutenant Donald Cameron and his crew fought faults, fatigue, and the defences surrounding the battleship. Inside X7, Lieutenant Godfrey Place and his men faced the same narrow world of gauges, trim, battery power, and water pressure. There was no broad view of the battle, no admiral's bridge, no horizon, only metal close to the face, only the sound of machinery, only the knowledge that a net cable, a patrol vessel, a mine, a depth charge, or one wrong reading could end the mission without anyone at home knowing what had happened. Above them waited Tirpitz, a battleship built to threaten oceans. The danger that reached her came through a space scarcely large enough for 4 men to breathe. X6 became entangled and was forced into desperate action near the target. Cameron, nevertheless, brought the craft close enough to release her charges. Escape became impossible. The crew destroyed sensitive material, abandoned the submarine, and were taken prisoner. X7 also penetrated the defences and placed her charges, but she too became trapped during the attempt to escape. Place eventually reached the surface and was captured. Robert Aitken escaped from the sunken craft later. 2 members of X7's crew, Conrad Whittam and William Whitley, did not survive. We've reached halfway, so please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment below. Would you have volunteered for a mission in an X-craft, knowing that success might still mean capture or death? X5 vanished with all 4 men aboard. Its precise part in the final attack remains uncertain. German defenders reported engaging another small submarine, but the full story went down with the crew. The closer the craft came to success, the less likely their crews were to return. The British prisoners were brought aboard the very ship they had attacked. That detail contains the whole strange scale of Operation Source. Men from tiny submarines now stood inside the giant battleship, while time fuses continued counting down below. The German crew did not behave foolishly. Once the threat became clear, officers tried to protect the ship. Search and defensive measures intensified. Attempts were made to move Tirpitz and reduce the effect of possible charges, but there was not enough time. Shortly after 8 in the morning, the water beneath the battleship erupted. The charges detonated. The force did not need to pierce the armor like a shell. It moved through the water and struck the hull from below. Tirpitz lifted under the shock. Men were thrown. Equipment broke loose. Lights failed. Compartments flooded. Machinery that had been aligned with immense precision was suddenly distorted, displaced, or torn from its foundations. Then came the second violent movement.
And afterwards, silence. Not peace. The stunned silence of a ship discovering that its size had not protected it. German internal reports recorded that the explosions rocked Tirpitz badly. Power stations were out of action because mounting bolts had been torn away. One power station was flooded. The double bottom had been damaged. Rangefinders and anti-aircraft control equipment were affected. One German sailor was killed and dozens were injured. The initial assessment to senior headquarters mentioned only a slight intake of water, yet the same naval record acknowledged that the success and damage were extensive and regrettable. That contradiction is the heart of the story. The battleship had not sunk. Germany could point to the hull above water and say that Tirpitz remained. But the machinery inside told another story. The damage report was not merely a list of broken systems. It was evidence that the defensive system had failed at its most important task. British midget submarines had crossed the approaches, penetrated the protected anchorage, passed the nets, reached the battleship, and placed charges close enough to disable her. The smaller the attackers seemed, the more embarrassing the result became. On the following day, German naval staff considered what should be said publicly. The proposed communiqué claimed that British midget submarines had been discovered and destroyed before they could carry out their operation. Yet the confidential report beside it already described disabled power stations, flooding, damaged control equipment, casualties, and serious concern over future protection. German commanders knew the attack had succeeded. The public wording attempted to turn penetration and damage into a defensive victory. This does not mean every German officer was deceived or that the ship's crew lacked courage. The German sailors aboard Tirpitz had endured a powerful underwater attack and immediately faced the enormous task of saving and repairing their ship. Nor does it mean Tirpitz was a weak vessel, quite the opposite. The attack mattered because she was formidable. Her survival demonstrated the strength of her construction and the skill of German damage control and repair teams. Repairs in an Arctic anchorage without the facilities of a major home dockyard became a major engineering effort. But survival could not erase the strategic result. Tirpitz was out of action for roughly 6 months. German leaders decided to repair her in northern Norway, accepting that full fighting strength might not be restored. Their own records noted reduced speed, limited steering capacity, weakened armament readiness, and the danger of attempting to move the ship south. When repairs were finally nearing completion in early April of 1944, British carrier aircraft struck again in Operation Tungsten. Operation Source, therefore, did not need to send Tirpitz to the bottom to succeed. It removed her from the immediate naval struggle during a critical period. It forced Germany to commit men, equipment, specialists, protective forces, and months of work. It also changed the psychological balance. Before the attack, Tirpitz was protected as though distance, mountains, nets, patrols, and armor had made her unreachable. After the attack, every disturbance in the water carried a different meaning. A battleship can survive an explosion and still lose something important. The damage was physical. The humiliation was strategic. Germany did not merely have to repair steel, it had to repair the myth that the ship could not be touched. For the Royal Navy, the success belonged not only to Cameron and Place, who were later awarded the Victoria Cross, but to every crew involved in the hazardous approach. It belonged to the passage crews who endured the tow, the submariners who trained through repeated faults, the men lost in X9, the crew of X5 who never returned, and Whittam and Whitley inside X7. There is a danger in remembering such operations only through the cleverness of the weapon. The machine was ingenious. The men made it effective.
They entered craft that could become coffins through a broken tow line, a leaking charge, a damaged battery, a fouled net, or a failure to surface. They continued not because the X-craft was safe, but because Tirpitz was dangerous. The price of reaching the giant was paid inside the smallest vessels. At the end of Operation Source, Tirpitz still floated in Norway. The flag remained above her. The armor remained around her. The guns were still visible against the mountains. But beneath that appearance, the ship had been shaken, flooded, disabled, and forced into months of repair. Germany wanted Tirpitz to be seen as a giant no one could touch. Britain answered with men inside machines barely large enough to survive in.
And after the explosions beneath the hull, the question was no longer whether Tirpitz was powerful. The question was whether she was still untouchable. If you watched until the end, write the word source in the comments. Like the video, subscribe, and share this story so the courage of the X-craft crews is remembered alongside the battleship they dared to reach.